little ones. So Walter sent 2 pigs down to the house for us to look after. We had no barn or no outbuilding to keep them in, so we got a tea chest and kept them in the kitchen. On Saturday morning, I looked out and I saw Peter coming over the snowdrifts carrying a large paper feed bag. In it, he had the 3rd pig, and this one was a little older, and he was harder to teach, so we fed him pablum. We called him Jethro because he was the biggest one in the 3. We kept them there in the kitchen for a week or 2, and I remember one Sunday we had Sunday school in church because there was no service in the church, and instead of heating it for Sunday school, they came to my house. And Betty was very embarrassed about what we were going to do with these pigs when we were having Sunday school. But the children were much more interested in the pigs than they were in their Sunday school lesson. They all enjoyed them. They were clean and sweet, and they were really cute. When the children would go to school, I would put a paper down on the floor and put their feet out. And if there was any place where there was sunshine, they would get there in the sunshine where it was warmer and eat their breakfast. And then I'd put them back in the box, keep them penned up. But we eventually got them moved out into the basement. And as soon as it was warm weather, we moved them into the hen house. So we didn't have any more hens in there after that.
Have you ever had any pets growing up?
When I was a child, we always had a cat for a pet, and we had a collie dog. He was very beautiful, but he got his paws cut by the lawnmower. No, by the mowing machine at one time. And we had to nurse him, but he recovered and made a pretty good recovery. But Mother used to bathe his foot and bandage it, and he would lie there very quietly and allow her to do that. And then when she wasn't looking, he'd be picking the bandage off and getting back so that he could lick his paw. But it got well, and he was quite lame, but he could get around quite well.
What was your life like back then compared to today?
We had electricity when I was about, I suppose, 10 years old. Before that, we used oil lamps. And that was quite a trial because the lampshades would get smoked up and they would have to be washed and cleaned and then polished with a clean cloth so that they would be good and clean. And I remember some of my nieces and nephews coming in and we showing them a lamp that we had used when we were children. And they were very amazed, and they couldn't imagine how we got it lit and how my brother would light it and then he would blow it out. Well, how did you do that? He was very surprised at how we used lamps.
Did you have a phone?
Yes, we had a telephone, and our number was 29-21, and it was a party line. And so when you heard 2 long rings and a short one, you knew that was your number. The storekeeper in the village used to call on Tuesday morning and ask Mother her order for groceries. And she would have a list ready on the telephone, so she would read off her order of groceries. And then the following day, he would deliver them. And we paid our bill once a month at the end of the month. And the grocer generally gave Mother a cigar for it. And she wasn't very pleased with that because she didn't really approve much of smoking, and she certainly didn't smoke herself. So finally he gave in and would give her 2 or 3 chocolates instead.
Did you listen to the radio a lot when you were younger?
The radio ran on batteries, which had to be charged periodically. And my father was a very great fan of hockey games. And it was very important to him to hear the hockey games and also the news. Gabriel Heater was a great news announcer then, and he always listened to him. But we had a few programs that we listened to, but it wasn't on constantly like it is today, because once the batteries were run down, then there was no more radio till the batteries were charged again. So that was a disadvantage there. We went to church regularly and Sunday school, when we were growing up. It was about 1.5 miles to the church, but we were always there, and I think it was our job to put the fire on, which was quite a chore. There was a shed away from the church a ways, which was used to keep the horses in the wintertime when the parishioners came by horse. And the wood was kept there, so it was quite a little ways to carry the wood and get the fire on. A wood stove in the church, and my sister used to always worry because we would put the fire on, and then we would go home, and she would think, what would happen if the church burned down? Never has. It's still standing there today.
Is there any questions that you'd like to be asked that we haven't touched base on that you'd like to tell us about?
I think it would be interesting that when my children were growing up, they worked for their uncle on the farm. The boys did barn work, and in the berry season they all picked strawberries, and they were all interested in farming, and they all had 4-H gardens. Their gardens got very weedy during berry time because when they picked berries all day they were too tired to weed, but when the weekend came they would have to attack their garden with real vigor to get it straightened out so that when it was inspected it would pass inspection, because the government officials came down and checked the garden. And once in the fall they had a display of their vegetables and were judged on them. And they each tried to have some different vegetable than the other so that they weren't competing against each other. I remember Betty had red cabbage, and one year they tried to grow parsnips, but the parsnips weren't large enough by the time August came, so that they weren't much success. But they did very well, and they enjoyed it, and there was public speaking, which was very important. Peter competed in that and did quite well. And they all had a trip of 4-H. Jim went to Quebec, Peter went to Saskatchewan, I think he went to Manitoba. And Betty went to Vancouver on 4-H trips in the summertime. And it was a great experience for them. Don't think Henry ever went. 4-H was sort of beginning to decline because it was hard to get leaders, and to get leaders who were interested and who would have the time to put into the program. But they had a parade in Fredericton, and they had their 4-H banner, and they had a uniform they always wore. It was a very good experience for them. I thought it was good training for them as children. 1969 was a very difficult year in my life. My mother was killed in 1969 in May in a car accident in the dooryard. It was a very traumatic event for the whole family. In June of that year, my brother-in-law, John Gilbert, died. And the following time, in November, my husband died. He had emphysema and had suffered from difficulty in breathing for many years. And he died that year. Jim was going to University of in Truro to agricultural college, and Betty was taking hairdressing at St. John. Peter and Henry were going to school here in Cambridge. We continued, and I took people in as what would be called a special care home now, and I kept 4 people in the house for several years until I finally was able to get daytime employment at the nursing home at Mill Cove. And I worked there till 1987, or 1989. There, I got that right. I retired in 1989. There, I got it right.
What are some of your interests?
Well, I've always been very interested in my church, and I taught Sunday school for quite a few years when the children were young and growing up. I've always been interested in the Women's Institute. My mother-in-law was a lifetime member, and I have become a life member. It's an organization that was begun in Ontario, and this year the Women's Institute in New Brunswick celebrated their 100th anniversary. It was celebrated at Perth Andover, where Mrs. Alma Porter began it, and she saw that women in that time had very little outside involvement, and they needed a certain amount of education to prove their lot. And she went about with her husband, who was a member of Parliament, and visited the farms. And her job was to hold the horse in the dooryard while her husband talked politics. Of course, women were not very much involved in politics then, but Mrs. Porter talked to the women as they came out to speak to her. Many of them were very isolated, and the Women's Institute became known as the University for Rural Women. It's has an association with country women around the world now. It's known as the Associated Country Women of the World. And some people say that it's one of the best movements for peace in the world because it works with women to improve their lot around the world. I'm a very dedicated member of the WI.
Can you tell us a little bit more about the Women's Institute?
Well, the Women's Institute was responsible for a good many programs in early times. One that I well remember was the Well Baby Clinic. And the children used to come here to this hall, which was a WI hall in those days. And the Well Baby Clinic was held here. The babies were weighed and measured and checked for any problems that they might have. And they received their needles here, too, for vaccination and so on. They also conducted many school programs that were helpful to the schools in those days. Hot lunches, and they promoted libraries and other things that were beneficial to the community.
This concludes our interview with Doris Knight. Thank you for this opportunity, A Legacy of History project.